When it comes to your own money, everybody has a PhD in economics. You don't need Larry Summers to tell you what's going on with your budget and your ability to feed your family or keep a roof over your head. So people get inflation. You can't fudge it. You can't spin it. It's like, hey, if I used to fill up my Ford F-150 truck for $50 and now it's $125, A, you get it. It's right in your face. And B, that's $75 that you don't have to take your spouse out to dinner, buy a new jacket or whatever. We're in a recession. I mean, it's not coming, we're in it. It's a triple, greatest bubble of all time, times 3 in the sense that it's real estate, stocks, and other asset classes.
That would mean like S&P coming off another 20, 30%?
Yes.
How do you position this when you tell people this, that guess what, this doesn't mean you should go jump off a building. There's actually a lot of ways to solve this or position yourself. How do you stay optimistic?
To your point, Brian, one of my favorite stories about how you can make money in any state of the world, there was a guy, Hugo Stinnes. Who's Hugo Stinnes? He was an industrialist in the early 1920s in Weimar, Germany, and he saw the hyperinflation coming long before it hit. So he went out and borrowed massive amounts of Reichsmarks, which was the currency of the time. And he bought industrial assets. He bought shipping lines, he bought railroads, he bought coal mines, etc. So then the inflation comes along and he paid the debts back. I would say pennies on the dollar, but it wasn't even that. It was like he paid all his debts back and kept the assets. He was the richest man in Germany. If you're the debtor and the money becomes worthless, you don't owe any money. Here's a penny here, I'll pay you back. But he kept the assets, which retain their value. What I say to investors and savers is, you got to see this stuff coming and do the right trade.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is James Rickards, the former lawyer and investment banker turned economist, thought leader, and author. You have over 35 years of experience working in capital markets on Wall Street in senior positions at Citibank and the hedge fund Long-Term Capital Management, as well as being an advisor to the CIA and the Pentagon. As a highly sought-after financial expert, you've been a contributor to publications like the Financial Times, the Evening Standard, and the Washington Post. You have topped the New York Times bestseller list on multiple occasions with titles including The Death of Money and Currency Wars, and your latest book, Sold Out, outlines your predictions for our post-pandemic future and how we can best prepare for the inevitable economic collapse. You believe that now we are facing unprecedented challenges that will ultimately lead to a great reset, a rise in CBDCs, and as a result, a cashless society. James, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you here. I just want to say before we get started that you recorded a separate video for us called Countdown to Crisis that talks about how this crash will be, and I quote, fast, bloody, and unavoidable. And people can watch this video separately at londonreal.tv/Jim. That's Jim. There'll be a link below. You also talk about how to position yourself to profit from this crash in 2022. So thanks for doing that. And Jim, where do we start? I think you were on the show here in London 5-6 years ago. I saw you over in Phoenix before that. But we're really in an interesting situation right now in the world. I don't think we've had such a openly obvious crisis when you and I have been talking. What do you see when you look out, you read the news about inflation, the war in Russia, everything going on with the dollar? What do you see, Jim?
Well, that's a great question, Brian. And, I write books and I also write several financial newsletters. So I'm thinking about topics all the time. And there's always one, usually you say, well, all right, this war in Ukraine is a really big deal. Got to cover that. implosion, financial implosion in China, really big deal. I got to cover that. Or what's going on in the U.S. with basically a mentally incapacitated president. That's, I don't know if it's unprecedented, but I guess since Woodrow Wilson anyway. And other topics, I could give you a long list. Maybe the end of the dollar's role as a global reserve currency, et cetera. The difficulty now are two things. Number one, they're all going on at once. Like, any one of those topics would, fill a newsletter or a present or, interview like this, et cetera. It'd be a big topic, a heavy lift, but they're all going on at once. And number two, they're not unrelated. There are all kinds of correlations. The breakdown and collapse of the global supply chain, which preceded COVID. A lot of people say, well, COVID came along. Of course, it messed up the supply chain. In my new book, Sold Out, I've got very, very good documentation that shows, no, the supply chain was breaking down before COVID. Now, of course, COVID made it worse, yes. And the war in Ukraine made it worse yet, yes. But this really started with Trump's trade war in 2018. So that, like I said, there's a thread that runs through all these things. So not to throw out my hands, I'm not going to do that. But when you ask me that, I'm thinking, well, you want to talk about China, Ukraine, supply chain, Biden, they're all a big deal. If in terms of tragedy, probably the war in Ukraine is the most important because it's highly, highly significant economically and strategically. But of course, it's a human tragedy going with it. If Chinese real estate implodes, okay, there's some hardship here and there, but it's not like people being killed or maimed or forced into refugee status. And that is part of what's going on in Ukraine. So that's probably the biggest single one, but I wouldn't miss the fact that all these things are going on at once.
What's the one that people are asking you most about? I mean, is it Americans looking at inflation and looking at, all of their savings kind of just going down to being worthless? Is that the one that are on a lot of Americans' mind right now? And
yeah, Americans, yes. It's interesting because I do have, kind of an international following, but there are certain pockets. I mean, there are certain countries where, there's interest in what I do, or my books are published in that language, et cetera. So I have a good German following, and of course the Germans want to know what's going on with energy, Japanese following and so forth. But yeah, the United States, the number one question, of course, everyone's concerned about inflation, but there's a big backstory there. But I always say when it comes to your own money, everybody has a PhD in economics. You don't need Larry Summers to tell you what's going on with your budget and your ability to feed your family or keep a roof over your head. So people get inflation. It's one of the reasons it's so politically toxic is because it's unavoidable. You can't fudge it. You can't spin it. It's like, hey, if I used to fill up my Ford F-150 truck for $50 and now it's $125, A, you get it. It's right in your face. And B, that's $75 that you don't have to take your spouse out to dinner, buy a new jacket or whatever. So there's kind of demand destruction at the same time you're spending more money on the one thing you can't do without. So people get it. But then from there, the question I get the most is, hey, Jim, is this going to cause a recession? Are we going to have a recession? And as recently as a few months ago, I would say, yeah, I think so. You can see it coming late this year, early next year. Now I say, we're in a recession. I mean, it's not coming, we're in it. And there's data. I never make statements like that, Brian, without supporting it. We know that, so first quarter 2022 is done, has been for a while. And the US economy declined 1.6%. That number's in the books. The second quarter is done. We don't have the official number. We won't until about 10 more days. The U.S. government will release that. But we have very, very good estimates, particularly from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. They have a kind of a real-time tracker. And as of today, they're saying second quarter down 1.6%. So the standard definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. There are a few more bells and whistles having to do with unemployment and a few other things, but that's the rule of thumb. So based on that, and based on the best available estimate for a second quarter, likely to be accurate, we're in a recession today. Now, it's not severe, but that's like saying I'm in bed with pneumonia, but I'm not dying. Well, okay, but we're in a recession right now. And there's a lot of whistling past the graveyard. I mean, the stock market is still greatly overpriced. There's still, the buy the dips mentality hasn't gone away. It's still there. You got people like Jim Cramer yelling, buy Netflix or whatever. There's institutional support. There's momentum trading. Of course, 95% of the trading is by robots. So you got to reverse engineer the 27-year-olds from Bangladesh who don't get out much. They're the ones really writing these algorithms. Brilliant engineers, but you'd have to show them around Wall Street. So all that's going on. So we haven't really seen the market collapse, stock market collapse that I would expect in association with a severe recession has not happened yet. This is just going to play out. It'll get worse as the year goes on.
All right, so you're expecting a major correction in stock markets on the back of a recession.
Alone. I mean that is my expectation. I have my own models and I look at it closely. But if you listen to Michael Burry, Jeremy Grantham, Charlie Munger, these people have been around and they run hundreds of billions, and they're saying the same thing. So Jeremy Grantham did so every now and then someone will throw some statistic at me. And I go, how long is your time series? And I go, we took it back 5 years. I was like, talk to me if you've done it for 100 years, because that's a little more meaningful. But Jeremy Grantham actually did do a 100-year time series and looked at bubbles all over the world, 1929 US, 1989 Japan, 2000 dot-com stocks, and many others. And he said he's never seen anything like it. It's a triple greatest bubble of all time times 3, in the sense that it's real estate, stocks, and other asset classes. So I do. That is my view, but it's shared by a number of other analysts.
And that would mean like S&P coming off another 20-30%?
Yes. And again, you have to remind people, 1929, everyone's like, October, I think 18th or 19th. It was late October 1929. The stock market fell 22% in 2 days. It wasn't one day. It was like 12% one day, 11% the next day. So 23% over 2 days. But that wasn't the crash. That was the beginning of the crash. This Dow Jones fell 82% from top to bottom. Now, it took 3 years. It bottomed in June 1932. Started in October 1929, so not quite 3 years. But that fell 82%. And that happens. So we're down. Nasdaq's down. Bounced back a little bit in recent days. Down close to 30%. Down the S&P down over 20%. We're in bear market territory. But that's just the beginning. That's not what a full bear market, market adjustment looks like in the face of the kind of recession that I expect.
Okay. And again, we had that special video, Countdown to Crisis. There's a link below, londonreal.tv/Jim, where you kind of go into what's going to happen with this crash, why it's going to be fast, bloody, unavoidable, but also how you can position yourself to profit from that in 2022. Yep. So thank you for that. Talk to me about inflation, because I was looking at some of the inflation numbers, and you have to go back to the 80s to see anything that's approaching double digit. I remember being just a kid hearing about double digit inflation. I could kind of remember the gas pumps, the lines at the gas. It's like a distant memory of me in the 70s. But how do you talk to, younger people these days about what inflation is or it means? Because I don't think people really grasp what it actually means to your savings or to the economy in even a medium term.
Well, that's exactly right, Brian. And if you, you're a little younger than I am, but I lived through it. I started my career in banking in 1976, and I remember my wife and I used to kid each other. She was in advertising, I was in banking, and the inflation was so bad, you'd get a raise every 4 or 5 months, and you didn't have to ask. They would just give it to you because they knew that you were going to quit if they didn't keep up. So she would get a raise, and she was making more than I was at the time. So we'd go out to dinner, and then I would get a raise, and I was making more than she was. So we would just tease each other about that. But that's how it was. And the psychology was, if you needed a TV set or refrigerator, new car, whatever, you say, I better buy it now, because the price is going to be higher. If I wait a month or 2 months, the price is going to run away from me. So it had huge behavioral effects. Of course, gold was, going to the moon. There was a lot going on at the time. But Brian, you're right when you say we're putting up inflation numbers today that are the highest in 40 years. That is correct. a little 41. Actually, it was 1981 before we saw these numbers. But I remind people, the inflation in 1981 was the end of a 10-year period of inflation. It wasn't the beginning. It's like, oh, that has some inflation. Yeah, we did. But it had started. I mean, in some ways it started in 1968 and it really took off in 1974, 75. So 81, these numbers, that was when Volcker finally got it under control. But you go back to 80, 70, 70, well, between 77 and 81, so that 5-year period, the dollar lost 50% of its purchasing power, not 15, 50 in that 5-year stretch. So you were putting up numbers, 10%, 11%, 13% and higher year after year. Yeah, 1981, it was 9 or 10, which is what they're comparing it to today. But that was on the downslope. It had been higher than that in 77, 78, and 79. So the question is this the beginning of an inflationary surge where it's going to get even worse and it is going to last 5 years? Or is it different than that? But keep that in mind, because the 40-year comparison, it is correct, but that was the tail end of an even worse episode.
And I think, Jim, you've actually said that this inflation is going to turn to deflation faster than most people realize. Can you explain what that means and then what that looks like and then maybe the ramifications of that?
Sure. That is my view. I'm happy to explain it. And it catches a lot of people by surprise. They're like, wait a second, Jim, it's inflation. You just look at 2022, starting in January, it was kind of like 7%. Then it was, it's 8.1, it's 8.6, now it's 9.1, which is true. That is the series. It is going up. So people extrapolate that. And again, there is this comparison to the 70s. By the way, I think the situation we're in today is very different from the 1970s, and I'll explain why. But we'll explain why right now, because in the 70s, it was triggered from the supply side with first the Arab oil embargo in 1973 as a result of the 1973 Arab-Israeli war, and then the price tripled, but it went from like $2 to $6. Okay. But percentage terms, that's a huge jump, but it was still $6. And then it got to 12. And then in 1979, you had a second oil embargo because of Iran and the Ayatollah and the revolution and the hostages and all that. And then it went from kind of 12 to 20. So oil went up by a factor of 10 in the course of the late 70s because there's two different embargoes. So that's coming from the supply side. But what happened was, the other source of inflation is on the demand side. So you have what's called cost push inflation. That's where supplies choked off, or there's an embargo, or there's a shortage, natural disaster, a lot of things. It's coming from the supply side, and demand is inelastic, so you just pay up or kind of do without. But the demand side is much more psychological. That's called demand pull inflation. That's when consumers behave the way I described. And as I say, I lived through the 70s, where, hey, I better buy it today, I better buy it now. You're pulling all this demand forward and bidding up prices because you're worried that it's going to get even worse. So as that applies to today, we are starting with the cost push inflation, mainly the price of energy, but the price of food is a big factor. And of course, they're related. It's like, here's the energy, here's the food. Where do you think the food comes from? To get the food, you got to feed the pigs and cows. What do you feed them? You feed them corn. How do you get corn? Well, you grow it on a farm. You need nitrogen fertilizer. You need diesel in your tractors. You get the food. You got to put it in a truck to get it from point A to point B. That requires diesel. The higher the diesel price, the higher the cost of food because you're moving it by truck, et cetera. So these things, as I say, are linked. But food prices are going up substantially, and the two things you can't do without are gas in the car and food. So you have that cost push inflation. We're not quite at the stage where it's demand pull. We're not quite at the stage where individual consumers are behaving the way I described in the 1970s, saying, "Hey, better spend the money fast because it's losing value," and you see that in inflationary expectations and inverted yield curves. And I'll come back to that because that's a really big deal. If you thought inflation was going to run away, as it did in the 70s, yield curves would be steeply sloping. and people would be in a frenzy to buy stuff. They're not, and the yield curves are not sloping or upward sloping. They're inverted. They're going down. That tells you that, and we also see this in inflationary expectations. Inflationary expectations don't drive inflation here and now. What does is inflation here and now can feed on itself. Inflationary expectations don't drive it, but they tell you a lot. They're information rich. They tell you a lot about what people expect. What the yield curve is telling us, what inflationary expectations are telling us, and other factors are telling us is that, yeah, there's inflation now, but the Fed's going to kill it, and they're going to kill it by destroying demand and throwing us into a recession. And here's where it gets interesting, because you could flip from this kind of inflation to disinflation or even deflation very quickly. And people are definitely not prepared for that. Well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Kind of everyday consumers are prepared for it. I'm not sure Wall Street and mainstream economists and policymakers are prepared for it. They're just extrapolating the inflation, saying, well, the Fed's going to kill it. Yeah, they might kill it, but at a price, at a very steep price, and consumers are really bracing for that. So, this even Jay Powell said the soft landing is a myth. There's not going to be a soft landing. It's going to be a hard landing, but that's not priced into markets. The markets are kind of pricing in a squishy landing or soft landing or from the runways. They're not pricing in a really hard landing, and that is what we're going to get.
Wow, it's going to be interesting to watch. And no one's talking about deflation, so that will be an interesting potential end to this. You talked also about an emerging global liquidity crisis, and maybe you could explain what that is. Obviously, last time you were here in London, Jim, you and I spoke about, the long-term capital management crisis of '98, where there was a real liquidity issue, and I think you guys had $1.7 trillion worth of derivatives at the time, and then we saw that happen again in '08. Well, first of all, maybe tell people, what is it like to go through a liquidity crisis? People don't realize how bad things were in '98 or even in '08. And then what would one look like now?
They kind of all look the same. I mean, they pop up in different places. In 1998, it was long-term capital management. The sequence there was interesting because that crisis actually started in June 1997 in Thailand, when there had been a huge capital inflows at a fixed exchange rate. And Thailand said, sorry, we're going to devalue the baht. And everyone said, oh, gee, I borrowed dollars and invested in Thai assets. Now they're worth half. Get me out of here. They dumped everything. And then that spread to Malaysia. That happened to be pretty well acquainted with Dr. Mahathir, who was prime minister at the time. He had some interesting stories to tell about that. Then Indonesia, then South Korea by the fall of 1997. And, the old expression, buy when there's blood in the streets. Well, sadly, there was real blood in the streets in Korea. There were riots and people were killed. And then it cooled off a little bit. And then up pops Russia, by April. And then that came to a head in August of 1998. And the whole world was waiting for Brazil. Brazil was the next dominant. Like I said, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea, Russia. Here comes Brazil. No, here comes long-term capital management. We were we were like a country in terms of size and leverage and all that. And that became the epicenter of the crisis. And of course, I negotiated that bailout, so I had a pretty front row seat. My wife remembers I was getting, if I got any sleep, a lot of people didn't sleep for 5 days, but I said, I got to get at least 2 hours in here because I got to make decisions. And one night I went to bed at 1 o'clock and I was going to get up at 5, but at 3 o'clock, the phone rang and it was the Italian finance ministry. They were looking for some information on some unsecured loan agreement they happened to be in. We were the biggest holder of Italian government debt. So I took the call and then she said, well, when you were done, you went right back to sleep. It took you 2 seconds to fall asleep. So that's how crazy it was. But
and you guys were the smartest guys in the room at Long-Term Capital Management. You had, I think it was Myron Black, one of the MIT professors that had done
we had two Nobel Prize winners. The creators of the Black-Scholes formula were it was Myron Scholes, Fisher Black, and Robert C. Merton. And it's called Black-Scholes, but everyone recognizes that Bob Merton made indispensable contributions mathematically, and he shared the Nobel Prize. To their credit, by the way, when those guys won the Nobel Prize in '97, Fisher Black had passed away, but Bob and Myron took the money and split it 3 ways and gave 1/3 to Fisher's widow, which was a very a classy thing to do. So that was and well deserved, of course. But yeah, so we had two Nobelists, but the average IQ around the place was like 165 or something. It was crazy. You should always aspire to be the dumbest guy in the room, and I actually achieved that on a number of occasions. But we had MIT professors. David Mullins was former vice chairman of the Fed, the youngest full professor in the history of Harvard University. And lesser known names, but well known in the industry. Greg Hawkins, we call him the Hawk. So there was no shortage of talent. But
so John Goodfriend from Solly was there as well.
He was not. John Goodfriend was the boss at Solly when these guys coalesced as the in-house arbitrage team.
Okay.
We just did, not to digress too much, but that blew up in a scandal. People went to jail in 1991 because Solomon. It was not our guys. It was Paul Moser lied to the Treasury. He was trying to corner the market in 2-year notes. It was right out of 1869. It was the gold squeeze, but he's trying to corner the market in 2-year notes, and there was a ceiling on how much any dealer could own. I think it was 25 or 30% of the issue. But he lied. He said, well, we're bidding for customers, which was okay. And he bought 70% of the issue, but he lied about the fact that it was for the house account. He was saying it was for customers. And of course, he came close to cornering the market, but it was found out. He went to jail. But that caused the board to fire everybody. John Merriweather was not fired, but he chose to resign in the face of, he was not implicated, but it was kind of like he was vice chairman, so it was hard for him not to be affected. But then they left as a group and formed Long-Term Capital Management. So we moved to Greenwich, Connecticut. So we were the northern version, reincarnation of the Solomon Arbitrage Group, of which Goodfriend had been the boss. Right. I met Goodfriend later, spent a lot of time with him. Interesting guy. But
how so?
What they missed.
How so?
What he in a very well dressed, $3,000 suit and tie kind of way. He was very vulgar. But it was like second nature to him. He wasn't like a guy gratuitously throwing around the F word. It was just the way he talked. And but he was a real Wall Streeter, very wealthy and all that. But he was every bit as vulgar in speech as I had been led to believe. So I was like, okay, you're the real deal. Okay, so you got a whole bunch of 165 IQs and 2 Nobel Prize winners and all the modeling technological capability you could possibly. What did they get wrong? They had an a priori assumption that when spreads widened, when I say spreads, 2 instruments, off the run treasuries versus on the run treasuries, or on the run treasuries versus treasury futures. And you could apply this to anything, Japanese stocks, French stocks, and we did. If they were essentially the same, and should be priced the same and would end up the same if held to maturity, that you want to own that spread and just wait patiently for the spread to converge and then close it out and take the profits. And because the spreads tended to be razor thin, you could apply high leverage. Now, isn't leverage dangerous? Yes, it is. But if you have a sure thing, if you know it's going to converge, and in fact, they were going to converge, you could leverage it comfortably and you were just going to make more money. So that's the idea. So when the spreads widened and you lost a little money on the trade, they would kind of say, well, a good thing just got better. Like the old school traders would say, it's nature's way of telling you you're wrong, get out of the trade. But long-term capital is like, wait, good thing just got better, buy more. Widens, hey, buy more. This thing's getting richer all the time. And then, but what's happening, of course, is that you're walking into a trap, because at the end of the day, in a global liquidity crisis, the spreads go like this. And then it's not a cliche, it's true. Markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And that was what they missed. We had $4 billion in cash. And we leveraged through futures and all that. And we had $1 billion line of credit. We had repo facilities everywhere. We were tough negotiators when it came to margin calls and all that stuff. And as I say, our accounting was so good, we knew how much we lost to the penny. This was never a case of mismarking or, gee, the market's going to get, what's going on? We knew exactly what was going on. That was kind of the scary part. It was like we did know exactly what was going on. But But things like that have two stages. Stage one is the market's moving against you. And instead of getting out early, these guys double down in what's called a martingale strategy in the firm belief that it would converge, which it would, but too late for them. But then there comes a time when the word gets out that you're the biggest victim, at which point you're the marlin and the old man in the sea. The sharks come at you. The street doesn't care about the market anymore. They systematically trade against you, and they will not stop until there's nothing left but the bill and the tail and the skeleton, that you're picked clean. So August was the world's going against us. We're losing a lot of money, but September 1998 was, no, the world is now systematically trading against us. There's no hope. There's no way out. And then when we called the Fed, because we knew more about that anyone, of course, we absolutely did not expect a bailout, and we were not asking for a bailout. We said, there's no way the Fed's going to bail out a hedge fund. I mean, come on. But we just being good corporate citizens, we're like, man, this is a problem. We ought to let them know before it takes down the world, because that was in the process of happening. And I'll never forget Peter Fisher, who was head of the open market desk at the time, and Dino Costa's right hand, and Gary Gensler, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Now he's the head of the SEC. These guys never go away. Gary and Dino and Peter came up to Greenwich and sat with JM and me for 6 or 7 hours. And we had computers, of course, but we had printouts of the positions. We just went page by page. And at the end of this, hours-long presentation, Peter Fisher, his face was white, and he said, blanched, and he said, we knew you guys were going to take down the bond market. We didn't know you were going to take down the stock market, because we had $15 billion of stock positions. We were the largest risk arbitrager on the street. Nobody knew that. Like, hey, you guys are bond guys. What are you doing in the stock market? We were in every deal. If you go back and look, Lockheed Martin, Lockheed Boeing, Citibank Travelers, MCI WorldCom. You go back and look at the deals of the time, we were in every one up to 4.9%, because you don't have to disclose until you hit 5. So we would cap ourselves out at 4.9. Nobody knew this. And it's like, you guys are going to take down every market in the world. And we would have. So that's when they went back and had breakfast with John Corzine was the head of Goldman Sachs at the time, and Sandy Warner at JP Morgan, and David Kamansky was head of Merrill Lynch, and they sat down and cooked up the bailout. Then there was like no sleep for 5 days. But my point is, the best description of a financial crisis I've ever heard is everybody wants her money back. Like, that's the easiest way to understand it. It's not like, this asset's bad. I'm out of this, I'm going into that, or I'm rotating out of this sector, getting into that sector, or no, it's like everybody wants his or her money back now. And so all asset classes behave the same way. They all go down, and all the spreads widen, and they keep widening until either there's a sequential financial failure, which was happening in 2008, by the way, just to jump ahead to that, or you shut every market in the world. We came within hours of closing every market in the world in 1998. We got the $4 billion in. There's a press release. Things calmed down, not right away, but we still lost more money after that. After Wall Street took us over, we lost another $500 million. But Alan Greenspan cut rates twice in a matter of days, and then things calmed down and kind of went back to normal. Actually, Wall Street made money on that deal. That wasn't their intention. They were trying to save their own skins. But a year later, it was liquidated, and they took their money back with a small profit. But at the time when you're in it, there's no rationality. There's no rotation. There's no safe harbor. It's like everything's going down. And we're getting close to that today.
And you're saying the same thing happened in 2008 when you saw Lehman going bust, a few others almost going bust, and you're like, okay, this is just happening again, except now it just happens bigger.
When I saw it in 1998, when I saw it in 2008, I wasn't even reading all the story. Like, I know this movie. I know how this ends. And yeah, Lehman, sure, big deal. But go back again, this goes back to what I said about 98. It started in 97. These markets are so large, the scale of the system is so large that it can take a year to play out. You have to understand the dynamics to understand that. And most people on Wall Street don't, because they're using badly flawed models and regressions and normal distributions of risk. I said none of that. That's all garbage, but that's what people use. But if you understand complexity theory and complex system dynamics, you also understand that it takes a while to play out. An avalanche starts with a snowflake and ends up burying a village. You're supposed to be looking for the snowflake. And in 2008, that started in 2007, August 2007. There were two Bear Stearns hedge funds that went, illiquid, basically suspended redemptions and closed their doors, and a money market fund at one of the big French banks, Societe Generale. But that was not Bear Stearns itself. That were the Bear Stearns hedge funds. Bear Stearns didn't bail them out. Typical Bear Stearns. Believe me, Bear Stearns refused to participate in the 1998 bailout of long-term capital. So when they went down in 2008, I promise you, no tears were shed on Wall Street, because that was like, what goes around comes around. It was the attitude. But so that was the start. But remember, Bear Stearns itself failed in March 2008. Then by June, it was Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. And then in August, the Congress passed a bailout law for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I was advising the John McCain campaign at the time. And I was on a call, and they were like all high-fiving, like, yeah, the crisis is over. Congress bailed out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We can get back to talking about the war in Iraq, because that's what we really want to talk about. And I, skunk at the garden party, I said, guys, you're not going to make it to election day without this getting much, much worse. I didn't say, September 15th, Lehman Brothers, although everyone knew Lehman was the weak link. I mean, that was true in 98. That was always true on Wall Street. They were always the weak link. But I said, you are not going to make it to election day without an exponential increase in this crisis. So why don't you get ready for that now? Write your speech, have a 4-point plan. It doesn't matter what the points are, just have them, and put your guy on the steps of Treasury and reassure the American people you'll win the election. I was laughed at, not invited back. I'm used to that. And then when it came, McCain runs around like a chicken with his head off, barging into the White House, demanding an emergency meeting. Well, Bush says, well, I can't invite McCain in without inviting Obama in, which he had to do. He didn't want to pick sides in the campaign. And there was a cabinet meeting, and Obama didn't know anything either, but he was smart enough to keep his mouth shut. And McCain's running around. So American people looked at that and they go, you're nuts. You kind of look calm, cool, and collected. If you look at the polls, they reversed. Obama was behind until Lehman. And then after Lehman, and days later, Obama went ahead in the polls. So that was a turning point in the election. But it's, and then, so getting back to 2008. So when Lehman came up in September, it was September 15, 2008, that was like the fourth domino. Not the first. Everyone remembers it. Oh, that all fell apart after Lehman. Well, it did, but you could see that coming a year away. And Morgan Stanley was days away from collapsing. Goldman would have been right behind it. Then probably Citi. Whether J.P. Morgan would have been the last guy standing, don't know. But there were many more dominoes to fall. And that's when Bernanke and Hank Paulson walked over to the White House and said, we got to do something, and they did. What they did is overnight they converted Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs into bank holding companies. Now, I've been a securities lawyer and bank lawyer for decades, and when you do applications to the Fed, depending on the politics, it can take a couple of years to get something like that approved. This was done like in a day, but the reason it was done was that the Fed could bail them out. Once they were bank holding companies, the Fed had the statutory authority to bail them out. They did. Then things calmed down, and we had a bad recession, and AIG was another wild card in the deck. But my point is a couple of points. Number one, you can see these things coming if you know where to look, but most people don't. Number two, they take a while to play out. So you get plenty of warning. But again, people ignore the warnings. And then finally, and it's important to understand there's a difference between a financial crisis and a recession. They're both bad, but they're two different things. 1998 was a severe financial crisis, but there was no recession. I mean, the NASDAQ hit an all-time high on January 1st, 2000. It went on for another year and a half, and there was no recession. 1990, 91 was an example of a recession, but no financial crisis. Some losses in commercial real estate, but there was no financial panic. 2008 was both. 2020 was a severe economic contraction. It's technically a recession, but it's kind of hard to know what it was. It's like, Anthony Fauci shut down the U.S. economy. So what is that? Yeah, GDP fell 32% in one quarter. 2 quarters. Technically, it was 2 quarters, but it was really 2 months, March and April 2020. But March happened to be in the first quarter, April was in the second quarter, so it took both quarters down. But that was really concentrated in about 2 months, and then it kind of came roaring back. But I call it a severe recession, contraction. But there was no financial panic in 2020. The stock market went down 30%, but it doubled from there. So these things can come together, and we're almost certainly in a recession now. The recession will get worse. So that's not priced into the markets, but you don't even have to guess. That's here. It's going to get worse. The question is, are we in for a financial panic? That's kind of what you were referring to, Brian. And the evidence is yes. The evidence is right in front of your face if you know where to look, but most people don't. It's a little bit technical. I can explain it in plain English, but the signs are there.
Okay. And I guess you go a little bit deeper to this in your separate video, Countdown to Crisis, where you talk about how this crash is going to be fast, bloody, and unavoidable. There's a link below, londonreal.tv/Jim. You also talk about position yourself to profit for this crash in 2022. Do you want to give us any hint about how that's right in front of our face, or should they go watch the video for that?
Well, I can give you more than a hint. Like I said, these things, they're often presented technically because some expert wants to seem smart or whatever, but you can do it in plain English. So basically what we're talking about, the warning signal, and it's a bright red flashing light, is an inverted yield curve. So what does a normal yield curve look like? So the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is interest rate. So, and treasury market's a good example, but there are other markets. I'll get to one in a second. So what are the maturities of treasury? Well, it's 30-day bill, 60-day bill, 90-day bill, 1-year bill, or 360-day bill, 2-year note, 5-year note, 7-year note, 10-year note, 30-year bond. So that's your x-axis. And interest rates they can be negative, but kind of 0 to whatever. A normal yield curve is upward sloping. It's the longer the maturity, the higher there. And that makes perfect sense. If I'm going to lend you money overnight, I might want a certain interest rate. But if I'm going to lend you money for 10 years, I might say, hey, Brian, you got to pay me a little more because, I'm taking more risk, et cetera. Perfectly normal upward sloping yield curve. And whether it's steep or flatter, okay, that's important if you're a trader, but upward sloping. But an inverted yield curve is downward sloping. An inverted yield curve says future interest rates are going to be lower than present interest rates. Well, why would that be? If I'm lending you money for a longer period of time and I want a risk premium and protect myself, why would I take a lower rate? The answer is because I think really bad things are going to happen. And I don't mean me personally. I mean, this is the institutional market. So, and we see this in the treasury market. It flips around day to day, but right now you have an inversion in kind of 2 years to 5 years. So a 5-year note is yield to maturity is lower than a 2-year note. And you see it in 7s to 10s. So the 10-year note has a lower yield to maturity than the 7-year note. It's not that the whole curve's inverted, but it's in sections. It is. So at the short end of the curve, 30, 60, 90 days, 1 year, yeah, it goes up. Well, that's because the Fed controls that part of the curve. They already told us what they're doing. We know they're going to raise 75 basis points in July, at least 50 in September. We'll see what happens in November. And then they have another meeting in December. But there's no reason to think the Fed is not going to remain on this path of 50 to 75 basis point interest rate hikes for the remainder of the year, which is going to get interest rates of 4%. Now, remember when they did this from 2015 to 2018, late December 2018, they went from 0 to 2.5.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.